about peripheral theaters. Okay, what's a peripheral theater? The main theater is Russia in this war, not what you think. Why? Because between 2/3 and 3/4 of German ground forces were always fighting Russia. That means these other theaters, which are peripheral to the main theater, take up between 1/4 to 1/3 of German forces. That makes them peripheral. Doesn't make them unimportant, but they're not the main theater. And by the way, who would want to fight on the main theater if there are alternatives? People die on droves in the main theater. So this man, Sir Julian Corbett, very fine naval theorist, a Briton, who was heartbroken in World War I that Britain ignored his naval strategy, which was don't do the continental commitment and run the war through these peripheral operations. And it wrecked his health. But here's what, according to Corbett, are the prerequisites for a theater that makes a really good one for a peripheral operation. One, it has to be overseas, so the enemy can't invade you or wreck your productive base. Secondly, you need local sea control to get in there, but that local sea access has got to be better than the land access because you want to have it easier for Britain to get in and out than it is for the enemy because then attrition rates will favor Britain. Britain also should deploy a disposal force. What's that? It means those forces you have who are in excess of what's necessary for homeland defense. It's not disposable force. It's rather a force that if everything goes south, you won't ruin the homeland, but you can afford to risk it on potentially very risky, but potentially war-changing operations. In addition, they got to be joint operations. Joint means cooperation of land and sea in this era. And in order, you're going to come in by sea, you're going to supply by sea, but you're going to be fighting on land. You better coordinate all that. And it's got to be combined operations. What does that mean? Coordinating with allies. You need friendly locals who are going to help you do all of this. And then you need to command your own forces. Why? Because you want to determine how they come in, how they go out. If it all goes badly, you want to be able to leave, which is what they did at Dunkirk. As much as a continental power might want to play this game, they cannot because they don't have the requisite sea access to pull it off. All right. The war winds up with Britain and the United States going through 4 phases. Well, Britain, all 4, some of the later ones, of 4 peripheral theaters. First, the North Sea. That's essential for British homeland defense. And there are 3 keys to the North Sea: Scapa Flow, Strait of Dover, coast of Norway. Britain always controlled the Strait of Dover and Scapa Flow. So Germany went after Norway to try and open things up that way. And Norway is not an ideal peripheral theater for Britain because the Germans had better land and sea access to that theater. They take Norway, and then they set up sub-bases at Bergen and Trondheim in addition to the ones they had at Kiel, Hamburg, and the Heligoland archipelago. And these are the things that are ruining those Arctic convoys. So that one does not go so well for Britain. It winds up facing a totally hostile continental Europe shoreline. The Axis has it all. All right, in the Mediterranean, there's certain keys that Britain controlled. Gibraltar, that's access to the Atlantic. Suez Canal, access to the Red Sea. Crete, that's access to the Black Sea. And then the British had a fallback position, a midway point at Malta if things went really bad. So the Germans attacked the fallback position because they're trying to bail out the Italians and fighting in North Africa. And so they're trying to take Malta because whoever's got planes there can cause convoys all kinds of problems, or they can protect their own things. And so Malta is blockaded by the Germans. It's not relieved until the end of 1942. So that is not great for Britain. It's threatening, its access to the empire. And the problem for Britain is Italian belligerency. Italians had been part of the Entente in World War I. Well, they're part of the Axis in World War II. And 3 of these keys, Malta, Crete, and the Suez Canal, lie in the center of Italian ambitions because they want an empire where they go down the Balkan coast and then they're going to go deep into Libya and Ethiopia to unify their empire around the Red Sea. And so Mussolini kicks this thing off, except then he gets stuck in Greece. And so the Germans have to come and bail him out. They chase the British out of Greece. the Britons are then on Crete, and then that falls to the Germans. So the Britons are in a world of hurt. The Suez Canal is under threat. Think about it. Fall of Norway, fall of France, blockade of Malta, fall of Crete. It is really bad news. However, when the United States gets into the war, the United States can help Britain retake some of these keys to the Mediterranean. And this is what is going on in North Africa. So Admiral Dönitz had saved it initially, but after the United States is in with more assets, Dönitz's oil, the tankers supplying his oil, 60% of them are getting sunk because Malta holds and Malta is supplied, and these tankers are getting bombed out of existence. And so Rommel loses in North Africa, not because he's the inferior general, he's a better general, he's just not supplied. And this is the key. And once you take North Africa, that peripheral operation, it opens the opportunity to go into Sicily and then the rest of Italy. And once you get that going, there's a possibility to do the Normandy landing. So there's 4 different peripheral operations. Some would argue that the air campaign over Germany was another peripheral campaign. You're bringing the war home to Germans, you're wrecking their productive base. And also, it's a major help to the Russians. Why? Because once the British start bombing Berlin, Hitler calls off air squadrons from the Eastern Front, and these anti-aircraft guns can be used against tanks or aircraft. He pulls those back, and that means the Germans no longer own the skies of Russia, and you're no longer going to be taking hundreds of thousands of POWs. Okay, so that's how the peripheral strategies worked out, but they're coordinated through allies, figuring out how to make all of them work. And here are the stats on allies. Alliances are additive, right? You should ideally add up all the complementary capabilities of you and your friends and then share them, divvy them out in an optimal way to deal with things. Well, the Axis alliance was also additive in the sense that the Germans added to their GDP, the GDPs of all the places they occupied. That pretty much accounted for GDP growth in Germany, except that whole way of doing things involves big occupation forces, which are big overhead of these conquered places, and you've also damaged them in the conquest, whereas the Allies are all game to help each other. And also, when Germany took over continental Europe, it's taking the big petroleum deficit zone because Europe doesn't produce petroleum. The North Sea oil, those things hadn't been discovered in those days. Yes, Romania has oil. Yes, Hitler takes Romania. But Romanian pipelines ran to pre-war customers. And it's very difficult to find the manpower and the steel to reroute all of your pipelines in wartime. So that's a whole other part of Hitler's problems. So as you're putting together these complementary capabilities, the Russians have a huge army. Most of the fighting takes place between Russia and Germany. The Russians wreck the German army. Millions of Russians and Germans are dying here. But if you look at Operation Barbarossa, which is Germany's initial invasion of the Soviet Union, they suffer a nearly 30% casualty rate. That's called catastrophic success. You have too many successes like that, it'll be catastrophic. And here's the mathematics of the main front. Only 2 countries have really big armies, Germany and Russia. Once the Germans maximize their territorial conquest, they've reduced Russian population because they've conquered all these areas to less than that of the United States. Yet, nevertheless, the Russians mobilize twice the army that the United States does. And if you look at the mathematics of munitions, the Russians on their lonesome produce more munitions than did Germany. Once the United States gets in the war, we produce $100 billion and whatever dollars it wasn't on munitions. And in that period, the Germans produced less than 40 billion. So bad news for Germany on all of these numbers. The trick is getting the munitions to the men. Whereas in World War I, that wasn't feasible. But now these railway lines have been completed and it's pouring in. And the Lend-Lease aid, you look at it, wow, Britain's getting a lot. Russia quite a bit, but less. China, nothing. What's going on there? You can only get aid in if there are ports and railways. Japan blockaded China. Proof of concept. It can be done. The Japanese did it. And you could not get stuff in. So what the United States was trying to do, the British thought we were insane. They're probably correct. We were flying things in over the Himalayas called the hump. Great. So you're going to fly in the aviation fuel to land. That's going to be the same aviation fuel that's going to get you back and however many other bombers that you can deal with in China. It's not workable. And Russia, even though it got a lot less than Britain because it's not getting ships, but it's getting equally valuable, useful things. For instance, Russia produces a lot of planes, but it didn't produce adequate high-octane aviation fuel. The United States had loads of that. The United States produced all kinds of vehicles, all kinds of rolling stock, locomotives. And this is what Russia used to transport everything. And the United States prevented Russia from going into a famine in the winter of 42, 43. We fed them. And this spam in a can, this is Hormel Interfoods contribution to the war. Everyone had so much spam during the war, it's canned pork. No one ever wanted to see it again, but a little can of pork, it goes a long way. It doesn't spoil in a can. And this Lend-Lease aid a quarter of it goes up through Murmansk. A lot of it gets sunk up there and not reliable. A quarter of it goes through Persia, and then half of it goes over the Trans-Siberian. And you go, well, what's this Axis alliance about? Why aren't the Japanese sinking any of this, right? Talk about a dysfunctional alliance. All right. So this is to tell you what happened with those Arctic convoys. You can see in 42, a tremendous number of them were sunk. And this is fully laden ships with scarce war material. So we and the British called them off for most of 42 and most of 43. And Stalin was beside himself. And so in 43, he's sending out feelers to Hitler, trying to do a separate peace. And luckily, Hitler was not interested. Hitler wasn't wasting his time with targeting empty ships on the home voyage. He was only going after the laden one. Okay, so what is all this Lend-Lease aid support? What does it add up to? Well, in Barbarossa, you got 3 million plus Russians going after 3 million Germans. That's a lot of people to supply and tie up. And as you watch that go, the Axis is killing Russians or making them POWs by the millions, but it's suffering 15% losses of its forces, and it's going to add up. So that when you get to August 41, that's when the siege of Leningrad, St. Petersburg begins. By December, the Axis are within 25 miles of Moscow. It is not looking good at all. But once the United States is in the war, you can start doing peripheral theaters like in North Africa. And then these casualties, while they aren't as significant as what's going on the main front, it's cumulative. So Stalingrad, the largest battle of the war is going on. You got North Africa. And then when you have Kursk, which is the largest set-piece battle of the war, is big tank battle. This is when Sicily's happening and moving up the Italian peninsula. And you can see the cumulative effects of these sequential operations and adding up both the main theater and the peripheral theater. So that when you get to Normandy, the Russians are tying up 228 Axis divisions. There are only 58 Axis divisions, all in Europe, Western Europe, Italy, and everywhere. So that's what makes Normandy possible, is the Russians really holding on to things. But when you start looking at the main front, the peripheral operations in Italy, and then Normandy, and then you have additional fronts in France, and then the Balkans, this continental cancer is into remission, that the Germans just can't sustain it. Okay, to summarize, before Britain had allies in this war, it was in a world of hurt. It was just losing one thing after another. But once you get the big continental buddy, don't dismiss the importance of a big continental buddy that is in the area where the fighting is taking place, not separated by the seas, but there with a big army. That was essential. And then once the United States gets in with its big productive base, then you can really start doing things. Because if you can command the seas, that's what the Battle of the Atlantic is about, then you can connect the world and get connect allies, theaters, resources. So here are the operational effects of these peripheral operations. You start with one where you can. If you win there, it'll open up a menu of more promising locations, all the while you're retreating your enemy's forces. And also, if you're doing it right, you're relieving pressure on the main front for Russia, which is doing the heavy lifting. The strategic effects, if you can do this successfully, is you're going to control resources for yourself, deny them for people you don't like, and this will help put time on your side. You're strengthening your alliance system because you're essential to each other's survival as you coordinate things, and you're dividing your enemy's attentions among multiple theaters, overextending them. So you start by trying to contain the problem, and as things go on, you try to roll it back, and then you go for regime change. So you're producing cumulative effects from these sequential operations. So that's how it works. Churchill, the great wit, talked about the hassles of dealing with allies, right? These are high stakes discussions. They don't always go pleasantly, but his idea is there's only one thing worse than fighting with allies, and that's fighting without them, because they'll be toast. You need these complementary capabilities, different locations, and coordinating it to gang up on your continental problem. Also, if you stick with it, you can help establish precedents, laws, institutions that'll hold the peace after the war. So that's his take. All right, so I've given you a big exposition on maritime solutions to continental problems.